Hey, what's going on, guys? I'm going to tell you about the truth about the Boxer Rebellion, okay? The Boxer Rebellion was a complex issue, but for the most part, the foreigners and the Chinese Christians in that rebellion were the good guys, and the boxers and the people, the boxers who fought for Empress Dowager, that was her name. They were the bad guys. She was a very conniving woman, became the concubine of a very prominent Chinese noble official, and worked her way up to be an empress. And she hated foreigners to begin with. Yes, before that, the foreigners signed some unequal treaties, like the Treaty of Nanjing, which basically gave Hong Kong to the British. But at the same time, the reason British pushed through opium in China is because 10% of the Chinese population was already addicted to opium before Britain got heavily involved in the opium trade. Okay? But that's a different video, way different video. Got off topic. There were some unequal treaties like that with the Treaty of Nanjing, which basically gave Hong Kong to the British. But Empress Dowager did not like foreigners to begin with. She said the colors eyes that Westerners have reminded her of cats, and she detested cats with a passion. And read the book Boxer Rebellion by Diana Preston. That's a really good book, and that discusses that. Also, the rebels were called boxers because they did a lot of physical exercise, physical stretches, and they did a lot of martial arts, so they were called boxers because of that. But they also believed that their martial arts would protect them from Western bullets, which it ultimately did not, and that their martial arts superiority, or what they thought was superior, would defeat the foreigners and the Chinese Christians. And before the foreign militaries came, and the foreign militaries that came were Austria-Hungary, Germany, Italy, Russia, Japan, United Kingdom, and the United States. Okay, they came to rescue the foreigners and the Chinese Christians. Before they came, around 200 Westerners were killed, and several Chinese Christians were killed. And they were killed basically just because they were Westerner or because they were Christian. They were not killed because they had stuff to do with the unequal treaties. Okay, the boxers did not distinguish between the two. Prime example, this involves Chinese Christians. What this group of female allies to the boxers called the Red Lanterns, what they would do is they would burn churches to the ground, lots of times using flames inside the Red Lanterns. They would burn churches to the ground, and a lot of times the people in those churches were women and children. Not always, but a lot of times they were. And many of the boxers thought that the Chinese Christians were not genuinely Christians, although they had little information to prove that. They called them rice Christians, that they only converted to Christianity because they were hungry and they needed some rice, which was not always the case, and a lot of times it wasn't the case. And there were cases where Christians were burned alive, where they had oil put on them or burned alive. I mean, those are cases that happened as well. And that's why ultimately the militaries came, and the military suppressed the Boxer Rebellion. The boxers fought very bravely and very gallantly, and they outnumbered the foreign troops. But at the same time, the Chinese Christians, they came to the foreign troops as best as possible, and they found refuge on their bases, and they were thanking the soldiers for coming, and they were shaking because they were so scared because of the stuff the boxers were doing to them. I mean, there were gang rapes that happened with Chinese female Christians, and it was just sick. And when the foreign soldiers got there, the rebellion was suppressed. It wasn't suppressed as quickly as they thought because the boxers, give them credit, they put up a very good fight, especially with the lack of technology that they had. But ultimately, because they didn't have the weaponry that the Japanese and the Westerners had, they couldn't win the war, and the rebellion was crushed. And China was basically forced to pay $330 million in reparations to these countries, and rightfully so, because a lot of the embassies were trashed, the diplomats were beaten up. I mean, and foreigners, just because they were from those Western countries, even though they had nothing to do with the unequal treaties, they were beat to a pulp too, and a lot of times killed. So the reparations were deserved, and the U.S. didn't use that money. The U.S. actually returned that money and gave it back to China, provided that China would build a university in Beijing, and that money would go to that. And many other countries did the same thing. So this was not an example of Western imperialism. This was not an example of the West trying to take over the world. No, they were trying to rescue people from their own country, as well as Chinese Christians from dying horrible, painful deaths at the hands of the Boxers. Now, the Boxers and Empress Dowager had some complaints, legitimate complaints, when it came to the unequal treaties. But at the same time, one, there was excess retaliation. Number two, even though they were attacking people who believed different than they did. And then number three, they were attacking people just because they were from the country that did the unequal treaty. That may have not had anything to do with it. And a lot of times they didn't. Sometimes they did, but a lot of times they didn't. So, and then there was a lot of killing of women and children just because they were Christian. And the troops had a right to come in, and they should have. Anyway, so if I was doing well, take care. God bless them. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.